Thank you, thank you. Thank you and welcome. Welcome to our first Youth Ministry Institute luncheon for 2019. Let me give you a hand for being here. No complaints, the weather is beautiful. I always get nervous for any type of programming taking place in February because it could be snowing, it could be freezing right now, but we have been given a beautiful gift of it being super hot for us, right? So there's no complaints. I am so honored to be here and to serve you all as the new acting director. I have big shoes to fill. Skip is one of my mentors, and I had the opportunity and the honor to work with him in the start of this ministry when we were just doing these lunches, and we are growing. So what you see happening today is truly a good problem. A huge problem, but a good one, okay? So we want to let you know that right here, if you have an empty seat, can you please raise your hand? Yep, I have one right here. So if somebody wants to come sit over here, you can as well. We want to make sure we want to accommodate you as the line is moving, and we want to give our speaker the necessary time that he needs to share with us. We do have a seat over here. Anyone else? Okay, perfect. But yes, again, it is a joy to be here. Skip, we truly thank God for. Can we give a hand to Skip, even though he's probably watching us? But we thank God for him and the vision and the legacy that he has left us, and just the passion. Because if anything, we are reminded of is that we're here for our young people. We are here because outside of these four walls, there are a lot of young people who need each one of us. Outside of eating this amazing lunch and coming monthly, we come so that we can get equipped to do this work. Our young people need us. They need our prophetic voices. They need our hands. They need our feet. They need us. So we must be reminded of this work, and I just encourage you to continue to do the work that you are doing in your churches, in your faith centers, at the schools that you're serving in, because, again, our young people need us. And because they need us, that's why we're here today, to get a little bit more information, to grow as individuals and ministers in the work that we're called to do. So without extending myself in this moment, I want to give time to our speaker. And the theme today is a good one. It's what's worth wanting. How many of you know of young people who want a lot of things? And maybe even some of us, we want. We're living in a world that it's all about, in a country that's all about consuming things, right? But today we're going to learn a little bit of that with Dr. Matt Croasmun. And let me tell you a little bit about him, and we're so honored to have him with us this afternoon. He is the Associate Research Scholar and the Director of the Life Worth Living program at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. And he's also a lecturer here at the Divinity and Humanities at Yale University. And he's also a staff pastor at the Elm City Vineyard Church in New Haven, and also the founding pastor there. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matt Croasmun with us today.
Great to see so many folks out here today. Let me start with this quick story, a couple of quick stories. A little bit more than 15 years ago, I was in the midst of relaunching a youth ministry in a church that had had a number of failed attempts at trying to get a youth ministry up and going. It had been going on for years. There'd be a sort of a surge of enthusiasm. People would get fired up. A series of meetings would happen, and then it would fizzle. And then another round of energy from parents, from volunteers would come in, and there would be maybe even a service trip or a retreat or both. And then after a few months, the thrill would be gone, and the thing would die again. This sounds like maybe some of you experienced this. The folks at the church had been actually pretty cynical about it, but the senior pastor had convinced the church to hire me as their part-time youth pastor. And as he told it, at least, I was going to rescue this youth ministry from these cycles of boom and bust. I was going to launch something that would last. And so I was hired at the beginning of a summer, and I spent the better part of that summer planning. I gathered a team. I started to get to know the kids. But we hadn't yet had a sort of youth group meeting. We were saving that launch for the fall. That was going to be our big moment. And so everything was building up. The decades of dreams of this church, the hope of these parents for their kids, to say nothing, of course, of my hope of my paycheck as I began Divinity school, and the senior pastor's belief in me and his confidence that I could turn this thing around once and for all. All of this was sort of building up to a head. And I'll never forget what this senior pastor told me during our last weekly meeting before the launch. He said he had an adolescent daughter, and so the topic of her participation in the youth ministry came up. He said, I'm really excited about what you're doing. I believe in you. I believe in what you're doing. I just got to let you know. We've been through a lot of cycles of this in our family. I will make my daughter go once. After that, it's on you. And actually, I will say, many years removed now, and as a pastor with a child of my own, I actually really respect that, right? I get he's trying to put some, he's saying, look, I'm for you. I want this to succeed, but it's not worth ruining my child's relationship to the church or taking away from her freedom to sort of pursue God as she would like. But it put a lot of just that much more pressure on this whole thing. It felt like this pastor had all of a sudden pulled the rug out from under me, like we were storming the castle gates, and right as we got up to the front, he gave me a thumbs up and a wink and wished me good luck. And so the question was for us every week, we had like 20 kids show up to our first meeting. 20 kids. That was the most that ever showed up for a youth ministry thing in this church. But then then the question was, how many are going to show up the next week? And you get, 12 or 14. You think, all right. How many are going to show up next week? How many are going to show up the week after that? And you're just sitting there waiting for that week when no one shows up and this whole thing falls apart. A few years later, I was we were just at the beginning of planting the Elm City Vineyard Church. Those same feelings, that sense of looming dread would return. This fear that someday it would all just fall apart. Especially in those early days, it felt like we were constantly sort of on the edge of viability. And I take it that ministry can feel this way, like you're just barely holding this thing together. And I must have let some of that fear, some of that concern slip to a mentor of mine at the time, and it sparked what is perhaps the greatest piece of ministry advice I've ever received. Yeah, that got some ears up. All right. If you take nothing else, this isn't even my idea, but this is the best thing you're going to hear. He said, you church planters are so worried about that day when no one shows up. You're worried about your failure. You're worried about that day when you finally call it quits and you have to walk out of the building and switch off the lights for the last time. He said, that is a ridiculous fear. The work of God has been advancing on the earth long before your local church existed, and it will continue long after it's gone. Be that next week, next month, next year, next decade, next century, or sometime after that. But I'll tell you what you should be worried about. Worry about that day when there are 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people in your church, and they're all being formed into the likeness of something other than Jesus. You worry far too much about your failure and not nearly enough about your success. That is what should worry you. That's what should keep you up at night. And I'll tell you, that has become an orienting insight for me. A flourishing ministry is not necessarily the one with the biggest numbers or the flashiest program. A flourishing ministry is the one where the people involved are formed into the likeness of Christ, being formed as the particular human beings they were created to be, but formed nonetheless in the likeness of Christ. And so today I want to talk about that work of formation. That work of formation that we hope is happening in our ministries. And I want to talk about the questions that are actually doing the work of formation in our communities, because I believe that it is the questions more than the answers that drive personal transformation. We become the people we were created to be, not through having the right answers, but by asking ourselves the right questions. Which means that we need to be really, really careful, really, really thoughtful about the questions that are driving our ministries, because the right answer to the wrong question can be more destructive than the wrong answer to the right question. Wrong answers to the right questions at least get you in the ballpark of where you need to be. At least you're asking the right question. Whereas the right answers to the wrong questions can give you a false sense of confidence, even arrogance, as you press further down the wrong path, as you become more and more enamored with a question that just isn't the one that will do the work of transformation in your life. The question that I take it should be the ground of our ministries, because it's the question at the heart of the Christian faith, is the question of the good life. The question of flourishing life, what the Bible calls abundant life, or the life that is truly life. Miroslav Volf and I just wrote a book about this. This is the most important question of our lives. And the answer to this question is the profound mystery of existence. A ministry, a church, a school, a university that is genuinely, doggedly oriented around that question and the truthful answers to be found where it leads, those sorts of institutions will form truly flourishing human beings, truly flourishing communities, a truly flourishing society. But as it turns out, this question is actually pretty slippery. It's easy to start with it in your sights and instead end up on some other sort of trail. Because this question has allied questions. Questions like, how do we live the good life? Or how do we make the good life available to all people? Or what do we as human beings most fundamentally desire? These too are valuable questions. They're crucial questions, no doubt. But these questions tend to conspire to hide the genuine question of the good life. These days especially, these questions pose as synonyms in order to conceal the most profound among them, in order to short-circuit our reflection and prevent us from probing the true depths of our shared humanity. And so charting our way toward a ministry that is asking the right question, toward a ministry that can do the formation work that ought to be keeping us up late at night, doing so requires pulling these questions apart, carefully distinguishing them, so that we can help our young people ask and begin to answer the most important question of their and our lives. And so today, my goal is simple. I simply want to disambiguate these seemingly synonymous questions so that we can recover the most profound question among them. Because by ordering them properly, by putting the genuine question of the good life in its proper place, all of these questions find their place. And they can help us find our way to that life which is truly life. So I want to describe to you 4 different modes of being in the world. One is reflexive. It's an embodied state of activity. And 3 are reflective to different degrees, asking 3 different sorts of questions that inform our way of being in the world. No, and you got to hear this clearly, no mode is bad in and of itself. All 4 need each other. But we experience these 4 as layers. That is, generally, we move between adjacent layers. As we enter into deeper reflection, and we move into deeper layers. When we move toward action And this too, we must do. We move into higher layers. And each layer actually depends on the layers below it, by which I mean this. Each layer depends on the answers given to the questions asked at the layers below, even or especially when those questions haven't been answered explicitly. So if we haven't answered a question, nevertheless, everything we do, everything we say, everything we think shows evidence of some answer to this deeper unanswered question. So we live answers to the deep questions of life, even if we couldn't give those same answers if we were asked for them point blank. So let's talk about this first layer. This first sort of surface layer is what I'll call the layer of reflexivity, right? This is we can think of as the autopilot. This is the layer where we simply do whatever it is that we do. When we're living only in this layer, we're not even aware of why we do what we do. Perhaps we're in a state of flow. We simply do what we do because that's what we do. And this layer is in this mode of sort of a matter of embodied practice. At this layer, life is lived out of the sort of knowledge that lives in our muscles and in our bones. The machinery of our lives individually and collectively just keeps churning, and we care not why. Much of life is lived up at the surface, and that's as it should be. In the best case scenario, what we do reflexively is fine-tuned to give us the results that we want, and what we want is actually worth wanting. In this case, our reflexive life reflects our deepest values, and indeed what is true independent of our values. If so, then we're the sort of people whom Aristotle would call wise. We have practical wisdom of the sort that a shipbuilder has. But in our case, what our hands know to do is not merely to build a ship, but rather to build a life. May all of us someday find ourselves in this situation. But a sort of positive, beautiful, elegant sort of state of flow isn't the only time when we do what we do simply because that's what we do. Reflexivity also marks our lives whenever we aren't reflective about our actions. This is the infamous unexamined life. So this layer can also be the one in which in our collective lives, say in a church or an educational institution, our daily routine has no deeper justification than that's just the way we've always done it. And it doesn't even take groupthink to start to operate this way. We can just as well live this way on our own. Cut off from deeper modes of reflection, reflexivity is a matter of mindless routine. The machine keeps on churning, but we have no idea why, which should be troubling. We have probably all experienced this sort of unhelpful reflexivity, the way that it can make us feel stuck and in desperate need of taking a step back and considering our habits. And we know, I take it, that feeling of relief when finally someone bursts into the room and asks, but is what we do getting us what we want? Or the pragmatic analog of this diagnostic question, how can we get more of what we want? Whichever form it takes, this is the effectiveness question. This is the heart of the design thinking so much in vogue these days. And if reflexive life isn't working, it is a great relief when finally this question appears on the scene. We're finally able to step back and reflect on our actions and consider whether they're really getting us where we want to go. For organizations, the moment in which this question is asked can be a watershed moment in which our daily routines are recentered and tuned around our goals. And there's a helpful ruthlessness to reflection in this layer. That's how we've always done it, no longer cuts it. And so new processes are designed, new practices are cultivated. If we're doing it right, reflection at this layer streamlines our daily routines and directs our energies. As a team, we say now that we're all pulling in the same direction. After a season invested in reflection in this layer, we can return to reflexive life with the knowledge that our new habits will yield actually the results that we're after. Now, that's all the good stuff. The disadvantage of this layer of reflection is that it is what we call ends agnostic. That is, there's nothing here that's concerned with whether the goals we have are the right goals, or even, frankly, with whether these goals are even really ours. An efficient system gets more of whatever you want, whatever that is. And that can actually be dangerous if you haven't thought all that hard about what it is that you really want. And think about it. An effective strategy for focusing exclusively on your professional goals and neglecting the most meaningful relationships in your life is actually worse for you than an ineffective strategy. If the ends are bad, then better means is hardly the solution. And I give that example, and maybe it sounds ridiculous, but the fact is that many of us live our lives never going much deeper than just these top two layers. Just living our lives, and every once in a while pausing and asking whether they're finely tuned enough. Are there some tips or tricks that we could take on, some life hacks that would help us be a little bit more effective? The effectiveness question strikes us often as the most insightful question that there is. And as a society, we marvel at those who are able to master it. Silicon Valley captivates our imaginations because its firms churn out products and services that seem to be able to do anything. They are masters of effectiveness. And indeed, a great lie of the 21st century is that the effectiveness question is the most profound question we can ask. The truth is closer to this. These days, the effectiveness question is the most profound question many of us can answer. But most of us, I take it, have experienced here and there in our lives a yet more significant question. A question that can rescue us from the ends agnosticism of life lived in the effectiveness layer. That is the question, what do we really want? What are we really after? Where are we really trying to go? This is the self-awareness question, which invites us to a process of introspection. From the hustle and bustle of reflexive living and the strategic tuning of the effectiveness question, we arrive in this layer at a quieter place, looking inward. We stop being distracted by what's most easily accomplished and instead ask what it is what we really want. Rather than valuing what's most easily measured, what's most easily demonstrated as effective, rather than just counting up numbers of people in the room, we take stock of what it is we genuinely value most. And the deeper we probe here, the more we apply this question recursively, asking again and again, what do we really want? The more we come to realize what we want isn't a set of discrete things, or outcomes, or feelings, or even, I don't think, character traits. What we want is actually more holistic than that. What drives us is an entire vision of a good life. Somewhere deep down, we have a vision of the life that we want for ourselves, for our communities, perhaps most clearly of all, for young people whom we care for. Of course, that vision is capacious. When I say a vision of the good life, I don't mean a list that specifies every little detail of a life or a script to follow. I mean the broad strokes. I mean what it is that we imagine when we imagine a life that is led well, a life that's going well, and a life that is feeling as it should. And even at the level of the broad strokes, this vision of life still involves choices. Perhaps what we want is a life filled with courage, or rather, instead, a life that most of all leaves room for the other. Maybe we treasure a life of abundant provision, or perhaps a life that has just enough. Do we want a life of ecstatic joy or peaceful serenity? Do we prize a life of independence, or perhaps instead interdependence? Choices abound, and the choices are ours. For this reason, the place of self-awareness can actually be a profoundly lonely place. As we probe the depths of our own intuitions, our own preferences, there's no escaping the fact that these visions and our reasons for preferring them are our own. Even if we do this sort of reflection together as a community or together as a group, we come to realize that our collective vision is inescapably ours. It may not be compelling to those outside. And yet, if we want to live with integrity, we will need to orient the rest of life, our effective strategies and our reflexive habits, around this vision of life toward which we are oriented. That is, the task we're presented with in the self-awareness level is to explicitly orient our lives around that which our lives have always already been oriented implicitly. Live true to our values. But even in the midst of a substantially actualized self-awareness, some of us have experienced the dissatisfaction that can creep in. This is the feeling that comes in moments of mid- and quarter-life crises. Whether or not we've been in this place ourselves, we all know someone who has. And when it comes down to it, we have the sneaking suspicion that if our lives go as we want them to, these are actually ironically privileged places, ironically privileged problems. We will land in this place eventually, if everything goes well. This is the place where we end up having a life fully oriented around getting us what we want. And in large part, perhaps we have it. And yet there's something still missing. Asking the effectiveness question doesn't help. In fact, the ruthlessness with which we've pursued our chosen vision of a good life seems itself to be part of the problem. And the self-awareness question won't help either. We could answer this question or this challenge by applying recursively the lesson we learned at the self-awareness level, but that quickly becomes a never-ending loop of introspective navel-gazing. The answer, sadly, I take it, is not within. The fact is, we wouldn't be where we are if we didn't really want whatever it is that we have now found wanting. The only question suited to these moments, the question with which we ought to familiarize ourselves sooner rather than later, lest we maroon our lives on the reef of effectively actualized self-awareness, is not what do we want, but rather what is worth wanting. Now, this is a question hardly ever whispered in our world, much less ever posed in all earnestness. Here we've entered the layer of self-transcendence. And if the self-awareness question pointed you to a vision of a good life that oriented your life, perhaps something like your compass, and the effectiveness question asked you about the reliability of your strategy in delivering the goods of that life to you, then the self-transcendence question asks you about the validity of that orienting vision. This question asks you, is that vision of a good life, the vision of the life that you want for yourself, your children, and your community, is that vision a vision of the true life? Is your vision on target? Has your compass properly identified true north? In the language of desire, is what you really want worth wanting? At this point, the self is no longer the center of our quest. We are no longer the point. In fact, quite the opposite. This question aims to push us out of the center. At these depths, we perhaps begin to lose our bearings. Here, the question is no longer about our intuitions or our desires. Here, the question is about truth. And this is unfamiliar territory for many of us. Indeed, in our day, the effectiveness and self-awareness questions often pose precisely as strategies for no longer having to wrestle with questions of truth. Those two questions suggest that we instead simply ask whether we are effectively getting what we want and be done with it. But the nagging question comes back to us again. Is what we want actually worth wanting? In dealing with these questions of truth, we need a different set of skills, a different set of mental habits. At these depths, the name of the game is normative inquiry. the erstwhile realm of, philosophy and theology. And actually, I take it that every humanities class you ever took should have been about helping you learn to wrestle with questions of truth in this register. And the good news is that if the self-awareness layer led us into isolation, in the self-transcendence layer, we find that we are not so alone after all. Here, others again come into view, for the question we ask in this layer has to do with them as well. In fact, having grown accustomed to being all on our own in that self-awareness mode, we may find these others troublesome, as we have to contend with one another about any claims that we make to truth. Even while we seek the truth, even the universal truth, we know that our own claims to this truth are still particular. Not everyone comes to the conclusions that we do. And if we don't attend well to this particularity and pursue charity in our conversation with one another over the truth of our claims, then our expeditions to this depth will have yielded nothing more than mere ideology. But it's not just our contemporaries that come back into view at this level. The ancients reappear as well. When we begin to ask the normative questions about the good life, we find that while we're perhaps in uncharted territory for ourselves and our contemporaries, we're actually right in the thick of conversations that the world's great traditions have been having for thousands of years. Moses, Plato, Confucius, the Buddha, Jesus, the prophet, to say nothing of more recent thinkers from Mary Wollstonecraft to Nietzsche to Martha Nussbaum. These folks have been asking this question: what is worth wanting, long before we stumbled upon it? And now their answers probably can't simply be our answers, because that would be to ignore the question of self-awareness, which we'll still have to attend to on our way back up to the surface. But their answers can help us, the way that they posed the questions, perhaps even more so. And in their and in one another's presence, I take it we will find that the question of the truth of the good life can be asked and with all humility begun to be answered. I take it that when we're thinking about a ministry oriented around the question of the good life, this is what we're talking about. A ministry that makes regular expeditions to this depth. A ministry that persistently asks the question, what is actually worth wanting? We're talking about ministries that invite young people to come under the water, to wrestle with the questions of worth that give shape to all the other questions whose answers we're always already living. Now, this is the part of the talk that I'll warn you, I tend to always underplay. So, help me. Hear this part loud and clear. After we plumb these depths, there is still a return voyage to be made. I'll just tell you, this is me. I love this. I live here, down here. That's not good enough. If you drag people with you down into this layer and never let them back up, what are you doing? Drowning them. Exactly right. Okay. So apprehending the truth of the matter does us no good if we don't appropriate this truth as our own. So the truth of self-transcendence has to become the vision of self-awareness. And any work we do at these deeper levels remains esoteric knowledge unless we have effective strategies to implement what we've learned in real life. Daily life can only ever be lived so intentionally. You've experienced this, right? We're close enough to the beginning of the new year to be close to New Year's resolutions, right? Daily life can only be lived so intentionally. So we need practices that can give expression to our insights. Things ways of letting this knowledge start to live in our muscles and in our bones. What we've learned with our minds needs to be inscribed in our bodies. And indeed, the relationship between minds and bodies isn't so simple. This process, like most processes, is one that we'll need to return to, I take it, time and again. And during some of our dives, I take it what we'll need to consider down below is whether our practices aren't smarter than our ideas. And actually do some of that work to figure out what are the ideas that are sort of embedded in our practices that have more insight than we've actually ever been able to appropriate. And often, returning to the surface will feel just like that. That is, a return to a place where we can breathe, to a place where what we've gained below receives life, where the visions of the good life become, bit by bit, good lives. If it would be foolish never to probe the depths that lie below the water, it would be equally foolish to try to live life always below the waterline. Such endless reflection can become, as one might imagine, suffocating. But if we learn to take these dives with some regularity, dives of different depths, no doubt, but never neglecting the deepest waters entirely, and I take it that we may indeed find our way together and individually with our ministries, with our communities of faith, our neighborhoods, and maybe even our global society into flourishing life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give another hand. And I love the illustration. So what we're going to do right now, we're going to have you pause and just reflect. Maybe even practice some of what we saw and was shared with us this afternoon. But just a time of pausing, and we're going to invite, I know some of our students have to go back to their classes, so we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we are going to reconnect where we will have our Q&A. But before that, I know some folks will be leaving. We definitely want to thank our student leaders and workers. Let me tell you, I started today, and they made all of this possible. So can you join me in giving a hand to all the student workers, leaders? They're busy. They made it happen. Thank you all. You all are awesome. I'm so blessed to work with you in this team. So we're going to take a time for just personal reflection, and if you need to leave, you can. I believe there's extra food, coffee, some dessert, and then we will reconnect in 5 minutes. Thank you. God bless.